in the denials of the white detectives who denied that they committed these acts of torture. And therefore, their confessions were then used against them to convict them, and like I said in the case of 12, send them to death row. One of the first known torture cases that came to light was that of Andrew Wilson. In February of 1982, he was accused of killing 2 white Chicago police officers, Fahey and O'Brien. And this sparked a manhunt on the south side of Chicago in '82 that terrorized countless numbers of African-American people. Eventually, Andrew Wilson was arrested by Burge and other white detectives. He was brought to Area 2 Police Headquarters. And what they did in his case is they handcuffed him across a hot radiator. And they then proceeded to take that electric shock box and attach it to his genitals, attach it to his lips, attach it to his ears, and repeatedly shock him. And then what happened in his case is every time he got shocked, he would flinch, and he would then get burned across the radiator. So he had burns on his chest and on his thighs. They beat him badly in his chest and his face, and they took cigarette butts and they burned it on his body. What was rare in his case is that he in fact had 17 different physical injuries documenting the torture that was committed to him. After he was confessed, he was then charged, and he was brought to Cook County Jail, where essentially he got medical treatment for the very first time. And at that point, that's when he got to see Dr. John Raba, who was head of Cermak Health Services, which provides health services at Cook County Jail. And after he was treated by Dr. Raba and others, Dr. Raba then decided to write the superintendent of the Chicago Police Department in 1982, who was Richard Breezak. And what he told him was that he had an opportunity to examine Andrew Wilson. He documented his physical injuries, telling him of the burns, and saying that Andrew Wilson had in fact complained of the torture. And he demanded that Richard Breezak, superintendent of the Chicago Police Department, conduct an investigation into the case and into the officers who were alleged to have committed these crimes, these acts of torture. Breezak did not initiate an investigation. Instead, he wrote to the head of the Cook County State's Attorney's Office, who back in 1982 was then Richard M. Daley, our former Chicago mayor. And what Breezak did was he basically said, I've been informed of allegations that Andrew Wilson has been tortured. What should I do? I don't want to interfere with your prosecution of Andrew Wilson. And essentially he was saying, I fear that such an investigation into the crimes of Burge and others would interfere with that prosecution. So the ball was then in Daley's court. What did Daley do? Well, he didn't initiate an investigation, which he had the power to do so. And he didn't tell Superintendent Breezak to initiate an investigation either. Instead, he used Andrew Wilson's tortured confession against him to not only convict him, but to send him to death row. And as a result, over 70 additional African-American men and women, including Darrell Hammond, were tortured by Burge and his men. Fortunately, the story does not end there. Andrew Wilson, while sitting in jail, filed a pro se lawsuit saying that he had been tortured. And that's when Flint Taylor, John Stainthorpe, and Jeffrey Haas from my office, the People's Law Office, then stepped in and represented Andrew Wilson in his federal civil rights case. And in the course of the first trial, Flint and others at the office received a letter from an anonymous police source who is now nicknamed Deep Badge. And what this anonymous police source then told Flint and others was that there were other acts of torture committed by Burge and others. And what he did was he then wrote subsequent letters to the office saying who Burge worked with and who were the so-called ass kickers who committed these acts of tortures and who were the good police officers who did not engage in such torture. And he also informed the office that Burge and his acts of torture were not unknown, that it was in fact known by State's Attorney Daley and at that time Mayor Byrne that these acts of torture were occurring under Burge's command and that they in fact condoned it and did nothing to stop it. So as a result of getting these anonymous letters from Deep Badge, people at the People's Law Office then went around and they started to interview some of the torture survivors they had been directed to. And then they started to uncover that in fact the torture that occurred to Andrew Wilson was not an isolated incident, but that it was a racist pattern and practice of torture. And they had then discovered 20 other individuals who'd been tortured by Burge and his men. They then went to trial in Andrew Wilson's civil rights case. And as the result of the first trial, there was a mistrial. And at the second trial, the judge presiding over the civil rights trial would not let the People's Law Office present evidence of this pattern and practice of torture. And instead, Andrew Wilson's trial focused largely on the evidence relating to the murders of the 2 white police officers, as opposed to the torture itself. And what the jury then ended up doing was returning a verdict in that case saying that Burge was not guilty, but that there was a pattern and practice of torture. It was a disturbing defeat that later was appealed and was reversed and came out triumphantly. But what I think is important about this moment, and this is why I share it to you, is that that did not end the story as well. As opposed to just taking this in the courts, what people did is they took the cause for justice to the streets. And organizers and activists and torture survivors' family members like Mary L. Johnson and others, they took to the streets. They took the information that was gained in Andrew Wilson's civil rights case, and they then started to demand that the Chicago Police Department fire Burge and others for their acts of torture. So they stormed Chicago Police Board hearings, they went and had hearings in front of the City Council, and they then in fact marched in front of Mayor Daley's home, because at this point he had been appointed mayor. And as a result of this organizing and this activism and this call for justice and this seeking of media attention, that is when the political winds changed. And John Burge was ultimately fired from the Chicago Police Department in 1993. The cause for justice then shifted. At that point, it then moved to the individuals on death row. The individuals on death row at the beginning in the 90s believed there were only 10 of them. And what they did is they organized themselves on death row. And they dubbed themselves the Death Row 10. And they worked with their family members and with organizers and with their lawyers to basically mount a campaign, the struggle for the Death Row 10. And again, there were several court hearings. People demanded that they be presented. These individuals had been convicted, but what their argument was is that there was newly discovered evidence to document the torture. And in fact, the city acknowledged that evidence because they had fired John Burge because of it. Therefore, they should not be on death row, but they should at least be entitled to have a new hearing to present evidence that they were tortured with the newly discovered evidence. And the sad reality is in countless numbers of those cases, I mean, maybe not countless, I think it's 5 or 6. 5 or 6 of those torture survivors lost their post-conviction petitions seeking such hearings. And again, it was important to take the cause for justice outside of the courts and to organize in the streets. And as a result of organizing and activism, some of the torture survivors started to get into hearings in the courts. Meanwhile, the organizers and activists with the Campaign to End the Death Penalty, the Illinois Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty, Civil Citizens Alert, and the rest, they then joined with the efforts to seek the commutation of all death row individuals' death penalty sentences. And the work around the torture cases, along with work to seek a moratorium around the death penalty here in Illinois, and later the commutation campaign, was successful. And in 2003, it culminated in Governor Ryan not only commuting the death sentences of all individuals on death row here in Illinois, but in pardoning 4 of the death row torture survivors: Aaron Patterson, Madison Hobley, Stanley Howard, and Leroy Orange, finding that their torture evidence was used against them to convict them and to send them to death row. And again, it was another phenomenal victory. I mean, imagine clearing death row and having 4 individuals walk off of it innocent, and the only reason being there is because they were tortured and giving these false confessions. But meanwhile, while this campaign for justice for the Death Row 10 was going on, there were several of us who were very frustrated. While it's true that Burge was fired from the Chicago Police Department, not a single one of the officers that he worked with, who also engaged in these acts of torture, were ever disciplined whatsoever. And in fact, most of them were allowed to stay at the Chicago Police Department, and many of them were promoted and allowed to retire with their full police pension intact. And in fact, Burge, to this very day, still has his Chicago police pension, even though he was fired. And so what it came to realize is that for many of us, we realized that Burge and the other torturers enjoyed impunity with respect to their crimes. And this led us to start the campaign to prosecute police torture. Again, we organized, we went to the streets, And we got lawyers from the MacArthur Justice Center to represent us in filing a petition in the circuit court asking for a special prosecutor. And special prosecutors were appointed in 2002. And they started to reinvestigate all of the torture cases. But after several years, we realized we did not think they were going to do a full investigation and seek full justice in these cases. We believed they were wasting millions of dollars, they were dragging their feet, and they were never going to hold Burge or others criminally responsible for their crimes of torture. And so at that point, Stan Willis, who's a really well-known civil rights litigator, and he's the founder of Black People Against Police Torture, he decided that in order for us to get true justice in these cases, we could no longer just work locally, but that we had to take the cases to the international arena, and we had to use the human rights framework that the world holds up as a system of justice in order to get justice here in Chicago. Because the fact is, all of our local authorities were somehow implicated in this torture, whether it was Mayor Daley, or Mayor Byrne, or Dick Devine, our former prosecutor, whatever it may be. So at that point, we had felt that we had exhausted all of our domestic remedies, and we then took it to the international arena. And we were fortunate because in 2006, the United Nations Committee Against Torture was holding hearings regarding the United States government's compliance with the UN Convention Against Torture. And essentially, the UN Convention Against Torture says no state party can commit acts of torture. And so I, on our behalf, had the opportunity to fly to Geneva, Switzerland. I found out with less than 8 hours' notice that I was going. And I had the opportunity to present evidence stating that the United States government was not in compliance with the Convention Against Torture because it allowed Daryl and other African-American individuals here on Chicago's own South Side to not only be tortured, but to not provide them justice and not provide them the remedies that we are entitled to under international law. And we were super fortunate because here there were 10 human rights experts, part of one of the highest human rights bodies in the world, who heard our cries for justice, who looked through our evidence, and who agreed with us. And after reviewing all of the evidence and all of our submissions, as well as the government submissions, they then issued a report in May 19th of 2006. Where in addition to finding that the United States government had violated the Convention Against Torture with respect to its acts against the war on terror, finding there was torture at Abu Ghraib, finding there was torture at Guantanamo, and calling on the U.S. government to close Guantanamo, they found that the torture that occurred here on the south side of Chicago to our African American men and women was equally as important, and it called on the U.S. government to do something. It noted the limited investigation in these cases and the lack of prosecution of Burge or any of the other detectives responsible. And it called on the U.S. government to bring the perpetrators to justice. And that is super profound